Well, thanks for that introduction, very generous, and also thank you for your book, which is of great assistance to me. I'll just start by giving everybody one piece of advice, and that is if you ever write a book and it wins some sort of book award in Italy, go for the presentation ceremony. You really don't want to miss it. Special Providence won a prize there, and I don't think I've ever had a nicer week in my life. All right, well, rather than answering these questions sort of one by one, I'll follow the example of Ambassador Ayalon and give you a kind of a synthetic overview. The first thing to say is that in some ways President Obama is more a symptom than a cause of difficulties in U.S.-Israel relations. And that's because in general, U.S. policy toward Israel proceeds out of a grand strategy that the U.S. has developed for other things. So, for example, between 1948 and 1967, U.S.-Israeli relations were fairly distant, and this had more to do with American Cold War strategy than with any sort of anti-Israel bias. In fact, again, American sentiment at the time was by and large pro-Israel. Then when the Soviet Union sort of intrusion into the Middle East made Israel a U.S. ally and partner in the Cold War, then again policy shifted, and may I say it shifted most under Richard Nixon, who was possibly the most anti-Semitic American president after World War II. Not that the competition is particularly tough there, but also a man who American Jews almost to a man loathed, and who certainly and he received absolutely no reward for his support for Israel in the American Jewish community. So it was strategic shift that was more responsible. The reason American policy over Israel today is particularly contentious is that since 9/11, there's been a deep debate about the best American response to terrorism and other problems in the region and Israel's place in it. And there's one response which we saw under the George W. Bush administration of saying that the United States needed to respond by becoming much more deeply engaged, fighting the terrorists over there before we have to fight them over here and so on. And Israel was seen as a major asset in that strategy. On the other hand, there is a group in the United States who says that America's big problem in the Middle East is that we are too deeply engaged and need to pull back. And in that context, a close U.S.-Israel relationship is a problem for American foreign policy rather than an answer. And so the terrorist attacks had the effect of dramatically raising the political importance of Middle East policy in the United States. So there's a polarization in American strategic debate, and the question is important. That's probably not going to go away. That sort of contentiousness is here to stay. You'll see it somewhat reflected in party things, but you will certainly find neo-isolationist Republicans who see the Israeli alliance as more liability than asset. And you will continue to see, my guess would be that if Secretary Clinton were to become president, her administration would probably work harder to keep a good relationship with Israel than perhaps the current president has done. So it's not, but the contentiousness in American politics and the polarization will continue. I think that on the whole, the policies reflecting engagement rather than disengagement with the Middle East will win the policy argument in the United States. For one thing, I don't think that President Obama's approach is seen by the American public right now as having been blessed by a lot of success. That disengagement doesn't seem to make America better loved. It doesn't seem to make the Middle East safer. It doesn't seem, and by the way, it would be unfair to call the president's policy one of disengagement, selective engagement, but it's not seen as a success. But also say that America actually remains more closely tied to the Middle East than some would say. There is the argument, you hear it among Arabs, we heard some of it today, that actually fracking and energy independence will detach the U.S. from the Middle East. That, I think, is an overstatement. Because suppose the flow of oil from the Middle East to the world markets was to be interrupted, all right? Well, maybe in America we would just keep fracking and enjoy all of our oil and gas, so we might not be standing in long lines at the gas pump as others would. But if the price of oil shoots to $300 a barrel or $500 a barrel in China, in Japan, in Europe, what happens to the American economy as the world economy goes into a massive depression? What happens to American corporations whose earnings are driven in large part by their foreign investments? What happens to our financial system when our banks are going to be closely linked to banks all over the world who are suddenly facing mass collapse or terrible economic depression? The reality is that America's dependence on a healthy world economy is the source of the economic source of our engagement in the Middle East. It's not going to change. Now, what may change, and to some degree has changed, is that in the old days, politicians didn't have to work to explain to the American people why you should care about the Middle East. It is that, we need the oil, they've got the oil, so we have to care. Now, actually, you have to make this sort of case that I just built for you, but you know what? It's an easy case to build. So I suspect that the consequence of this shift will not be as great as some think. So that's the first point. I think that the strategy argument is going to be resolved more or less on the side of continuing engagement and even a sort of forward-looking, proactive engagement. To some degree, we have the rise of ISIS to thank for that it refocused minds in the United States on the threat. It's very interesting to see how polls have shifted since last summer with those ISIS attacks, and how in both parties you've actually seen a political response to a changed mood of the American people. Well, administrations do what they do. But you can certainly see in the Republican field, and I think in Secretary Clinton's positioning of herself, a political response to a changed situation. There's another thing to look at in terms of U.S. attitudes toward Israel, and that is that behind this appearance of steady pro-Israel sentiment, which is real, there are some changes that need to be thought through and analyzed. In the old days, support for Israel in the United, and by old days I mean like the 1950s and 60s, support for Israel in the United States was by and large stronger on the left than on the right. If you wanted to hear people talk about the importance of Israel and why America should stand by it, you'd go listen to Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson talk. And they did it for what we might call Wilsonian reasons. For one thing, the first major political decision of the United Nations was to support the partition of British Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, and with the acceptance by the Jews of Palestine of partition, they got the high ground. They supported the two-state solution when the Arabs didn't, and that gave them the high ground. So if you believed in the United Nations, you believed in world peace, well then Israel was your cup of tea. And also I might point out that Joseph Stalin supported the independence of Israel, so that if you went to a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert where Pete Seeger was an actual member of the Communist Party of the United States, you would hear them playing Zionist folk songs from the kibbutz at these left-wing rallies among American kids. But here's what's interesting about this. The American support for Israel was Wilsonian and left-wing. It was also, by and large, rather ineffective politically. It didn't get much done. Think of Eisenhower siding with Egypt against Britain, France, and Israel. That's probably the most dramatic American reversal of alliances. It makes Obama look like a piker. So in that sense, what's interesting to see now is those are by and large the people today who are the most sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, would be the sort of left-wing, idealistic crowd. And so if Eleanor Roosevelt were around today, it's quite possible she would take a different view. In her youth, she was actually rather anti-Semitic, but she evolved, as they say. She might have continued to evolve had she lived another 50 or 60 years. In any case, when we look at this, we see that the Palestinians now have support, and I think a critical mass of support in the United States, that we will not, as a country, abandon the two-state solution. That will remain a kind of an axiomatic part of the American approach to the region, as in fact it has done pretty much since the 1920s. Where the Israeli side has gained support in the United States is among the people that I call American Jacksonians, named for Andrew Jackson. Very quickly, so you'll have some idea of what kind of man he was. In 1818, he faced a problem. He was the general of American forces fighting Indians in the state of Georgia. These Indians were being supplied by, as we might now say, these terrorists were getting weapons of mass destruction, say liquor and rifles, from two British traders who were in what was then Spanish Florida. Well, Jackson's approach was very simple and direct. He sent the U.S. Army across the international border into Spanish territory, captured the two British traders, brought them back to the United States, tried them before a military court, and hanged them. Now, right there you have, I think, in one episode, everything the European Union hates about American foreign policy. But there were a lot of Americans then, and there are a lot of Americans now who kind of go for that. And these Jacksonians, populist, nationalist people with a somewhat who believe in military force and believe in fighting the bad guys with everything you can, don't really believe in disproportionality. You know, they don't think that, well, if a couple of rockets come over from Gaza, all you're really allowed to do is send a couple of rockets back. They sort of think, no, you should actually go in there with everything you've got and crush them. So, and that if anybody gets killed in that process, by the way, it's the fault of the people who started firing the rockets, not the fault of the people who tried to stop the rockets. So for these Jacksonians, Israel is now a tremendously important country. They value it, they admire it, and it speaks to a lot of very important instincts that they have, not only about how the world should work, but how the United States should work. The problem, I think, for Israelis in looking at this and trying to evaluate this is that while Jacksonians are numerous, there are a lot of them, and the polls show this. By the way, Pew polls showed that about 2/3 of the American people favor the use of, and they use this word in the poll, torture in at least extraordinary circumstances. That's, I think, one marker for Jacksonian thinking, is that sort of cold, hard realism about a security threat. In any case, they're very numerous, but they're not well represented in the opinion-making classes, in the bureaucracies. Your average Jacksonian doesn't dream of a lifetime job as a State Department cookie pusher. Okay? You'll find more of them in the military, you'll find more of them out of government, and they oscillate between being tremendously focused on foreign policy. So on December 8th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Jacksonian America was ready to take on all comers. But on December 6th, 1941, Jacksonian America just wanted to stay out of World War II and hoped we wouldn't get involved. So as the basis of American popular support for Israel shifts into this group, one has to start understanding how is this influence different from the influence of other groups in the American political spectrum? Why does it mean that American support for Israel in the polls might not be reflected in day-to-day policy? And also, again, for Israeli public diplomacy and other things, how does one respond to this, and how does one try to reach out to some of the people that one needs? I would also just like to say a word, although I am wearing a tie, by the way. I should say I'm not an American Jew. I am only an American. So let's not stereotype here. But if you look at why liberal Protestants in America and some secular liberals and lefties are turning a bit anti-Israel, I think you'll find that a lot of the intellectual element of this are things that they share in common with the majority of American Jews who are also left of center on almost every issue in the United States. I think it's still the case that only among African Americans does Barack Obama have more support than American Jews. And so perhaps for Israeli governments and Israeli officials trying to think about how do you engage with not just the people who like you in the United States, but the people who are annoyed with you, a very good marker to that is to start thinking about how does one deal with liberal Jews in the United States? How does one address the concerns that they have, say to the Israeli-Palestinian question or other issues about Israeli security and social development? That's a difficult question because that gets, of course, into Israeli politics as well, where the Israeli left, by and large, is closer to the majority of American Jews, and the Israeli right is closer to a minority of American Jews. And this requires, I think, a lot of thought and a lot of soul-searching within Israel, both by the left and the right. But it's important. It's important because, again, I don't think that Jewish opinion in the United States sways our policy on Israel. I think by and large it is the 98+% of Americans who aren't Jewish who have by far the greater weight. But the intellectual, social, and cultural arguments and perception that fuel the growing estrangement between liberal American Jews and Israel are pretty much identical with the issues that the segments of the non-Jewish world in the United States that have moved away from Israel emotionally and intellectually, that move them. So work with these people and figure out how does Israel make its case in that venue, and that will help you think about how do you make a case in the broader American venue. I'll close with one final thought on something that the Israeli government could do to make things better. It may sound a little odd, but I think there's potential here. And as all of you know, I think in this world of the Middle East and peacemaking and so on, potential is one of the more difficult things to identify. So if I seem to be reaching a little bit, I still think this might work. The biggest development in sub-Saharan Africa in the last generation has been an explosion of theologically conservative Christianity. Much of it closely connected theologically and even denominationally with American evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity. What this means is that in a number of African countries, you will now find significant majorities of the population who share the theological presuppositions of Christian Zionism, and in many cases are expressing it openly in church and in other venues. Try to think for a moment of what it would be like to have a caucus of black African states in the United Nations who are pro-Israel and who perhaps denounce the neo-colonial attitudes of European delegations for their reflexive anti-Zionism. Try to imagine also the impact that might have on African American opinion in the United States, where again there are quite close links, and where there is a strong desire among many African Americans in the United States to try to, the Joseph idea is a very powerful vision for African Americans. I am your brother Joseph, who you sold into slavery. Now I am Pharaoh's right hand, and in spite of what you did to me, I will help you. And so that sub-Saharan Africa for Israel is not just a road that leads to sub-Saharan Africa. You know, the way that Henry Kissinger once said that Argentina is a dagger aimed at the heart of Antarctica. Sub-Saharan Africa actually for Israel, I suspect, may have a broader implication in its policy, and it's a place where I think intelligent Israeli diplomacy, aid, activism, educational work, and other things could not so much generate something where nothing exists, but help something that already exists crystallize and become more effective. Anyway, thank you very much.